Hello, everybody. I'm Nicholas Gillen, and I'm here to present on random number generation, how random number generators work, why we need them, and where they're used in cybersecurity. So, just to start out, what is random number generation? What are random numbers? Why do we need them? Random numbers are something that we are constantly using in our real world to, simulate the real world, because real life is very unpredictable, but computers aren't. So we use a lot of random numbers in things like statistical sampling, computer simulation, simulating the real world, gambling, gaming, and of course cryptography. Creating random keys requires random numbers. But as we know, computers are not good at generating random results. When you give them certain input, they'll give you the same output every single time. So how do we get computers to generate random numbers? And there's kind of two different approaches that we combine to generate truly random numbers in our computers. The first part, or the first section, is pseudo-random number generation, which is the algorithmic approach to generating these random numbers. Essentially, we get a random seed and we feed it into an algorithm. That algorithm just does a bunch of mathematical computations on it and then spits out the result as the quote-unquote random number. Now, of course, if you know the seed, you'll know the result, but the idea is that you just run it recursively, essentially, over and over again to generate seemingly random numbers over time. Since this is just mathematical operations, computers are very, very efficient at doing this. That's what they're designed to do. But it doesn't create true randomness. It's all deterministic as long as you know the initial seed. So we combine this with true random number generation, which is based on the entropy that is found in the real world. So it measures physical phenomena that are known to be random, and it measures them in a way, turns them into usable by the computer bits, and then uses that as seeds for pseudo-random number generators. So true RNGs have to be based on random things in the real world, things like radiation, wind pressure, wind speed, the movement of lava lamps. Anything that's we can monitor in the real world that is random can be used as a basis for entropy for our random number generators. So what makes a good random number generator? There's a few characteristics that are very important to have, so that way when we are generating these random numbers, they're not predictable. Of course, the first thing is that it needs to generate unpredictable outputs. If you can predict the next number based on the current number given to you by the random number generator, then it's not good. The whole purpose of creating random numbers is that they're not predictable. So if you make a predictable random number generator, you have failed. And this has a ton of consequences, especially in cybersecurity, but in pretty much every area where if you know what's going to happen next, there's no reason to make it random. The next thing is that output should follow a uniform distribution. So this is an important concept that essentially means that every single number needs to have an equal chance of being picked. So if you have a random number generator, for example, that can only pick even numbers, 2, 4, 6, etc. That drastically cuts down the entropy of your random number generator because it cuts your options in half. That makes it incredibly easy to guess. It makes it way easier to predict if half of the options that are normally there are not. So having high entropy is crucial, and this is done by making sure that the distribution of random numbers is uniform. Everything is equally likely. If you know that every key is going to start with 1, because that's how the odds shake out, then it exponentially makes cracking all of your random numbers very, very easy. The next major characteristic that we need to look at is for pseudo-random number generators specifically. This is not really a problem that true random number generators have, but pseudo-random number generators, since they're an algorithm, they will eventually repeat itself. So they need to have very long periods, and a period is essentially the cycle that a pseudo-random number generator goes on. So an initial seed needs to be presented. It is fed into the algorithm of some sort, and then that output generated here is fed back in as the initial seed. And so this loop will repeat over and over and over again. Since there is a finite number of states in the computer, eventually it will have to repeat itself. So the idea for a good PRNG needs to have a very long period so that you don't generate 10 numbers and then it starts repeating itself, and it's the same 10, it's the same 10. Then it becomes trivial to predict. So you need to make sure that it does not repeat itself for a very, very, very long time. And the next one is that all of these previous ideas need to be consistent for every single seed. So say this initial seed is very good and it it has a very long period. It gives output that follows the uniform distribution and it's not predictable. But say, for example, you're not using this and you're just using the number 1. And every time you feed the number 1 into this, you just get 1 back. And then it's an infinite loop of 1, 1, 1. That's not random. It's not uniform distribution. Well, I guess technically it's uniform distribution if 1 is your only option, but it's not unpredictable. So since that seed does not work for that random number generator, the random number generator is flawed in some way. Any seed that is fed into it should be able to produce good results, because if an attacker finds out that a particular generator was initialized on a vulnerable seed, then every single key generated by that generator, that random number generator that was vulnerable, becomes exploitable. They can easily crack everything that was generated by it. Tying this directly to cybersecurity, where are these random number generators used? Why are they so important to be strong and actually truly random? A lot of cryptographic algorithms heavily depend on secret, strong, random keys. Pretty much every kind of cryptographic, like encryption and decryption, requires a key alongside of it. So these keys need to be random, because if they're not random, then, by definition, they're predictable. So if we can predict your keys, then there's no point in having a key, because anybody could just look at it and figure it out. So they need to be truly random keys that are secure and not easily crackable. These keys are generated with a combination of true random number generators, which harvest real-world entropy to initialize pseudo-random number generators that can then efficiently create a lot of random numbers at a time without slowing down, because running a true random number generator over and over again is very resource taxing, and it would not be able to keep up with the demand for random numbers, because the demand is very, very high. So there's a lot of very, very drastic vulnerabilities with random number generators, which is why it's so important to get them right. If the initial seed is too predictable, like in the previous example where if we use 1, it ruins everything. If it's too predictable, then they could just run the simulation from the beginning. If they can predict your seed, then they run it from the beginning with that predicted seed, and then they will know every single random number that your generator has ever created, which obviously puts at risk anybody who has ever used that random number generator. Another thing is that the current state of entropy, if it can be replaced by another known state by the attacker, so say for example, you are taking a user input to determine your random numbers, if that can be used by the attacker to replace the entropy that's in there with something that they know, then like if they know the initial seed, they can then simulate every single random number from then on out. Essentially, the main goal for creating a random number generator that's secure is making sure that attackers do not have the ability to gain access to the algorithm and the seeds being fed into them, because if they get those, then they will be able to simulate from that point onward everything that it generates, because it is deterministic in nature. And like I kind of said previously, if your generator is vulnerable, it's not just you that is vulnerable, it's anybody who has ever depended on that generator. So if one generator a vulnerability is found in it, anybody who relied on that generator is vulnerable from any key that is produced by it, because that vulnerability will be to every random number produced by it. So any random number, anybody who used it can be easily predicted their keys. So now we're going to look at a couple examples of these vulnerabilities, these weaknesses in real world examples. So for the first one, in 2012, 0.4% of all RSA keys used in SSL communications were compromised over the web. Essentially, these researchers were looking at all of these, RSA public keys, and they wanted to try and factor them with 2 of the same prime number. Now, this should be incredibly unlikely. It should be a lot less than 0.4%. It should be way, 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 way down, because these primes are supposed to be thousands of digits long. If they're the same, then that should be a statistical anomaly. So they were able to find that a lot of these or some embedded devices like routers, VPN devices were using very, very predictable random numbers. They would use the same P and Q, which made factoring very, very easy. And this happened from very poor initial seeding. So essentially, the true random number generator, the hardware random number generator that they were using to harvest real world entropy, was not actually that random, and it was producing the same result every single time. So the initial seed was essentially always the same, and that wouldn't be itself a RSA breaking problem. It would be bad because if someone found that out, then they could predict every single RSA key by that generator. But theoretically, the RSA key should be different because after that initialization of the first seed, even if it's bad, the algorithm, the pseudo random number generator that takes control after that, should create seemingly random numbers. However, it was being reset. The entire seeding of the system was being reset in between the generation of the P and the Q, and that meant that you was getting the same result because it would initialize, get the initial result, reset, initialize in the exact same way, and produce the same exact prime number. And this is a problem, of course, because it became very, very easy to factor them, and this is a very major failure at the initialization process of the embedded system because it was just generating the same number essentially over and over again with no randomness. A second vulnerability that we're going to look at comes from a Debian Linux release. In 2006, they released one that had some changes to the OpenSSL package. Now, the OpenSSL package is a package that takes care of generating random keys for the system, things like SSH keys, OpenVPN keys, as well as session keys for SSL connections. A lot of random keys are generated from this package. When they were going through trying to make all their code cleaner, updating it, they found a piece of code in the OpenSSL package that was generating compiler warnings. They looked at it, they thought it was redundant, so they removed it. This piece of code that they removed was actually adding entropy to the random number generator. So they completely removed a large portion of all the entropy used from the system, which made the random number generated by it very, very predictable. How it worked is it started with the process ID and then fed that into this code that would increase the entropy of it, add more random numbers, do more mathematical calculations on it, pull in more random data to create a truly random seed that was then fed into whatever algorithm it needed to go to. Instead, all that was removed, and it just used the process ID, fed that straight into whatever algorithm was being requested. And in Debian Linux, the default maximum process ID was 32,768, which, as you can imagine, makes the entropy super, super limited, because then there's only 32,000 possible initial seeds. Now, a computer can go through 32,000 possibilities in seconds, so this was a major, major problem. And when this was discovered, a mass worldwide regeneration of keys had to happen, because these keys were incredibly weak. Only 32,000 possible combinations is really, really, really bad, and can be brute forced quite quickly. So now we're going to kind of go through the process of how to create a good random number generator. What is, kind of the nitty gritty of it, so to speak. So the very first integral part of a random number generator is that it harvests a good source of entropy at the very initial step. If the very first step is weak at initializing the entropy of the system, the whole system is going to be weak, because if that initial state can be easily predicted, then they don't need to predict anything else because it's deterministic from that point forward. So having these sources of high entropy is super, super important. And things in the physical space, in our physical world, are the most random. If you try to start your initial entropy from, your digital computer level, just picking, like a number in memory or something, that, has its problems. So one such example of this is Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a service that provides these kind of keys and encryption and such. And what they do for one of their primary things, they have a couple other options as well, but the main thing they're known for is this lava lamp wall. So they have a wall in their office, and they have a camera pointed at it, and it's just filled with lava lamps, as you can see. This image, this live camera feed, frames are taken from it, when requested, and it is turned into the data, the ones and zeros, and that is used as their initialization vector, so to speak, for their random number generators. They have this wall of lava lamps, but of course that's not the only randomness, because the movement of the lava lamps, the liquid inside of it or whatever is in there, is almost impossible to predict. So all of those movements alone are very good, but since it's a camera, it has its own kind of sensor noise. The light in the office is constantly changing. People can be, walking in and out of frame. All of that just adds entropy to the system, because these completely unpredictable events of, like, say somebody walks in the office, and nobody could predict that. That adds to the entropy of the system and adds for more possibilities of what that initialization seed could be. They have other offices, one that does radioactive measurements, and another one that has a wall very similar to this lava lamp wall, but it's pendulums instead. Now, if you don't want to go that extreme, or you're trying to make one by yourself that's not camera based, there are other sources of entropy that are a bit easier to use that are random. So things like thermal noise in your electrical circuits. So this just kind of comes from the electrons moving around in your circuits. There is just an inherent threshold of noise that will be produced by all circuits. Since there's a lot in your computer, this can be measured and used as kind of an initialization seed for everything. Other things like atmospheric noise, if you have a way to pick up sound, as well as clock drift, which is an interesting one. Since your computer clock is not absolutely perfect every single time, it can take, or your program can take, the time between clock ticks and use that as kind of a basis for RNG. But these are not as good as something like measuring just stuff in the real world, like what Cloudflare does. And the most important part of this true random number generator section, is that you don't use a constant value. If you have a constant predictable value, like the time since January 1st, whatever, that's going to be really, really bad. You want to make sure that every time you initialize your pseudo-random number generators, it is completely random, unpredictable in every way, and that is just pulling straight, that harvesting that real-world entropy that works so much better than the things in your computer. After we get that true source of entropy from these true random number generators, we then need to feed them into pseudo-random number generators, because the demand for them. True random number generators are great at creating actually truly random numbers, but they're not very efficient because you have to take real-world measurements. So it would not be able to keep up with the demand, as we discussed earlier. So we need to feed them into pseudo-random number generators. There's a problem with a lot of pseudo-random number generators, especially like linear or multiplication ones that are just simply, feed in the seed, multiply by a certain number, mod it, and then spit out the result, is that they leak information about the state of the generator every time they produce a result. So the state of the generator is what we need to keep secret, because if they're able to know the seed, know the algorithm, know any other excess, like extra entropy that we're adding to it, if they know those things, then the values are very easy to predict. Or it's not very easy to predict, it's a joke to predict, you're just running the calculations. So we need to make sure that our pseudo-random number generator does not leak information, that every individual number is actually truly seemingly random and there's no discernible pattern. So this is where CPRNGs come in, which are cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generators, which is quite the mouthful. And these secure two things, or ensure two things about the random number generators, and that they are statistically random, so they pass statistical randomness tests. This essentially means when you're given a random string of bits, the probability of guessing the next bit in the sequence should not be above 50%. If any prediction algorithm is able to predict above 50%, just given a completely random string of bits, what will be generated next, then it has failed and it is not statistically random. And thus is vulnerable to these same prediction algorithms that are predicting this kind of thing. The second thing is that the past workings of the random number generator stay secure even when the current state is revealed. So when the current state of the random number generator is revealed, we need to make sure that everything before that is secure. So say an attacker gets access to the seed, they get access to any extra entropy we're putting into it, and the algorithm. They can calculate from then on out easily. And there's nothing really we can do about that. But what we can do is make sure that everything before that is safe, that it's not reverse engineerable. So you can't take the result from the algorithm and get the input from it. The input should be completely independent from the result, i.e. it's not, you can't reverse engineer it. And these CPRNGs are generally based on other cryptographic functions, things like ciphers, hashing functions, or hard mathematical problems. Think like RSA math. They're math problems that are thought to be difficult to compute. So now looking at some examples of reliable CPRNGs. Like I said, ciphers can be turned into it. So here is an AES block cipher in counter mode that is used to generate random bits, random numbers. Essentially, it is an altered version of the actual cipher itself, where it gets fed to it over and over again, where blocks at a time. But instead of generating blocks of ciphertext, it's generating random numbers. So we want it to be truly random, and we're kind of throwing away the keys, so to speak, so that it's not reverse engineerable. Another potential is hashing functions. You can't reverse engineer the hash. So essentially taking our random number, running it through a hashing algorithm, potentially adding more entropy during or right before, right after the algorithm is a great way to increase the security of it. But just, recursively running through hashing algorithms, very efficient and also seemingly random, because changing even just one bit of the sequence makes it unrecognizable. And of course, there's also the mathematically hard things. The Blum-Blum-Shub algorithm is essentially kind of RSA math, where you have your P and your Q. These are large prime numbers that are determined beforehand. Those numbers are then subtracted from our random seed, and then it divides it by 2, finds the greatest common denominator. It's kind of this RSA math where you can see the final result, and if you could factor it, you could figure out exactly what's going on behind the curtains, but factoring that is computationally very, very difficult, and so it is secure for that reason. So I hope you've seen the importance of RNGs in security, and why our random number generators need to be perfect. Essentially, they need to be reliable, because so many cryptographic algorithms that we rely upon are dependent entirely on the initial random seed that we were given. All of the keys that we use, they're random. They need to be random, and if they're not random, then there's no reason we have security at all. If people could just look at your house and predict what the inside of the key looks like, then you might as well not have a lock. So having these actually secure keys that nobody can predict is super, super integral to our personal communications, anything we do online, the security of any intelligence agency in the world relies on randomness to keep everything secret. Of course, using a vulnerable random number generator will compromise every application that depends on it. So it is super, super important just at the base level that when you're creating random number generators, or you're deciding to use a random number generator, that you make sure it is secure. Because if it's not, then anybody who uses it is vulnerable. Even, you just say, give me a random number, I don't really care, I'm sure it's random, but then there's a vulnerability found, you will have to regenerate your key, because attackers will know that, they will know the vulnerabilities of that random number generator, and they'll know you used it, and they can connect the dots, easily compromise any account that is tied to it. Just as a final wrap up, going over the main crucial characteristics that good random number generators that you use in security have, is that the numbers generated from these random number generators are not easily reverse engineerable. So when you request one, you can't easily figure out exactly what's going on and then follow that line, look at anybody else who's using it, and know exactly what's going to be produced, because they are deterministic in some sense. Another important part is that the initialization is done with sufficient real-world entropy. If your very, very beginning step is flawed, then it's very easy to guess, and anytime you use that random number generator, it will be bad, because attackers will be able to predictably guess the initialization. If they know the initialization, then they know everything. And of course, the final most important characteristics of a random number generator is that it is sufficiently random. If it's not random, there's no point. Thank you for watching.